The notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the apartment door while Sarah Chen was at work. She found it when she returned home that evening, her daughter Maya asleep against her shoulder, the girl's 6-year-old body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that came from a day spent pretending everything was fine at school. Sarah had learned to recognize that weight. It was different from the natural tiredness of play. It carried the tension of a child trying very hard not to be a burden. She shifted Maya carefully, unlocking the door with the practiced quiet of someone who had grown skilled at not disturbing fragile sleep. The envelope lay white against the worn carpet, its presence immediately distinguishing itself from a usual accumulation of pizza menus and furniture store advertisements. This was official. The paper was heavier, the printing sharp and formal. Sarah carried Maya inside first, laying her gently on the narrow bed they shared in the studio apartment's only separate space. The girl stirred but did not wake. Sarah pulled a thin blanket over her, tucking it around shoulders that seemed smaller each time she noticed them. Maya had been eating less lately, though she claimed she wasn't hungry. Sarah knew better. The girl was saving food, leaving portions on her plate that Sarah would quietly finish later, both of them performing a dance of pretended ignorance that broke Sarah's heart a little more each day. She returned to the envelope, picking it up with hands that trembled slightly. Official mail rarely brought good news. It brought reminders, final notices, demands for payment on debts that had accumulated with the relentless patience of compound interest. She had been careful, so careful, but medical bills did not care about caution. Her ex-husband had left when Maya was 2, disappearing so completely that even the state's child support enforcement agency had given up searching. The lawyer's fees alone had consumed what little savings she had managed to build. Sarah opened the envelope standing in the small kitchen area, its countertop cluttered with a microwave that worked intermittently and a hot plate that was their primary means of cooking. The apartment did not allow full stoves. Fire hazard, the landlord had said, though Sarah suspected it was simply cheaper to maintain units without them. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the text once, then again, trying to make sense of words that seemed to resist comprehension. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, located in a city 3 hours away. The language was dense, formal, constructed with the kind of careful phrasing that lawyers used when they wanted to sound important while saying very little. But beneath the bureaucratic layers, a single fact emerged with startling clarity. Her mother's distant cousin, a woman Sarah had met exactly twice in her life, had died 6 months earlier. The estate, such as it was, had been settled, and Sarah, through a series of genealogical accidents and the absence of closer relatives, was listed as a beneficiary. The inheritance was not money. It was property. Sarah read the description 3 times, each pass failing to make it sound less absurd. A residential structure, the letter stated, located on Blackwood Lane in the town of Meridian Falls. The property had been condemned following structural failure. Current assessment value, minimal. The estate's executor, bound by the terms of the will, was required to transfer ownership to the listed heir. Given the property's condition and the costs associated with demolition, the executor was prepared to facilitate transfer for a nominal fee of $1, plus standard filing costs. The letter concluded with a deadline. Sarah had 30 days to respond. If she declined, the property would revert to the county, which would assume responsibility for its removal. If she accepted, she would become liable for all associated costs, including any municipal fines already levied for code violations. Sarah set the letter down and stared at the wall. The paint there was peeling in one corner, revealing layers beneath. She had noticed it weeks ago but had not reported it. Maintenance requests in this building were met with suspicion, as though tenants asking for repairs were somehow inconveniencing the landlord by expecting the space to remain habitable. She had learned to ignore small deteriorations. They were easier than the alternative, a condemned mansion. The phrase sat in her mind like an object too large to be properly contained. She knew Meridian Falls vaguely. It was a small town, the kind that had once thrived on industries that no longer existed, leaving behind empty storefronts and streets that looked frozen in an earlier decade. The name Blackwood Lane triggered no recognition. She had no memory of visiting such a place, no recollection of the cousin mentioning property there during the two brief encounters Sarah could recall. The first meeting had been at a family funeral when Sarah was 12. The cousin, whose name she struggled to remember now, had been elderly even then, stern-faced and silent throughout the service. The second meeting had been years later, shortly after Maya was born. Sarah had driven to the cousin's small apartment to introduce her daughter, operating under the vague notion that family connections mattered, even distant ones. The visit had been awkward and brief. The cousin had held Maya for perhaps 30 seconds before handing her back, murmuring something about the child being small for her age. They had not spoken again. And now this, a transfer of property that felt less like a gift and more like the shedding of a problem. The letter's tone made that clear enough. The estate wanted to be finished with this obligation. Sarah was simply the most convenient recipient, a name on a list, someone legally entitled to inherit what no one else wanted. She thought about the deadline. 30 days. The number felt both generous and impossible. She had no savings to speak of. The nominal fee of $1 was not the issue. It was the filing costs, the potential for additional expenses the letter hinted at, but did not specify. It was the liability the executor so carefully emphasized. Accepting ownership meant accepting responsibility for a building that had collapsed, for fines that might already exceed anything she could pay. The rational choice was obvious. Decline. Let the county handle it. She had enough problems without adding a condemned mansion 3 hours away to the list. And yet she did not immediately dismiss it. Something in the absurdity of the situation held her attention. A mansion, even a collapsed one, even in a dying town. It was more than she had. More than the studio apartment with its peeling paint and its landlord who raised rent annually while repairs languished. Sarah looked toward the small alcove where Maya slept. The girl had been asking questions lately. Careful, tentative questions about why they didn't have their own rooms. Why other kids went on vacations. Why Sarah worked so much. But they still couldn't buy new things. Maya had never been demanding. She had never thrown tantrums or complained with the kind of aggressive disappointment some children wielded like weapons. Instead, she had grown quieter, her questions fewer, her acceptance of their circumstances so complete that it frightened Sarah more than any outburst could have. She made no decision that night. She folded the letter and placed it in the single drawer where she kept important documents, a small collection of papers that chronicled years of careful struggle. Birth certificates, immunization records, the divorce decree, the medical bills, neatly organized by date, that she paid in small increments whenever she could. The letter joined them, becoming part of the archive of her life's complications. The next day, during her lunch break at the call center where she worked, Sarah searched for information about Meridian Falls. The town's official website was outdated, its design suggesting it had been created a decade earlier and never updated. The photographs showed a main street lined with brick buildings, a town square with a bandstand, the kind of picturesque, small-town imagery that felt borrowed from a different era. Population, 3,200. Median home value, $68,000. Unemployment rate, significantly above the national average. She found a local news site next, its articles sparse and focused on municipal meetings and high school sports. There was no mention of Blackwood Lane, no recent stories about condemned buildings or structural collapses. She tried searching property records through the county assessor's office, but the database required an account she did not have time to create before her break ended. That evening, after Maya had gone to bed, Sarah called the law firm. The number rang 4 times before an automated system answered, offering options in a voice that was polite but impersonal. She pressed the extension listed in the letter and waited. The line clicked, then connected. The woman who answered introduced herself as Ms. Brennan, assistant to the executor. Her tone was professional, efficient, the voice of someone accustomed to handling estates without emotional investment. Sarah explained that she had received the letter and had questions about the property. Ms. Brennan's responses were careful, measured. Yes, the structure had experienced significant damage. No, The estate could not provide detailed information about the extent of that damage beyond what was contained in the official assessment. Yes, there were municipal fines currently assessed against the property, totaling approximately $1,400 for code violations and failure to maintain. Yes, those fines would transfer to the new owner upon acceptance of the deed. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. $1,400. That was more than a month's rent, more than she had in her checking account, more than she could reasonably acquire in 30 days without going further into debt. She asked whether there were any other costs she should be aware of. Ms. Brennan paused, then offered a carefully worded response. The property's condition made it difficult to predict all potential expenses. There could be additional fines if the structure continued to deteriorate. There could be liability issues if someone were injured on the property. The estate could not guarantee anything beyond the basic transfer of ownership. The conversation ended with Ms. Brennan repeating the 30-day deadline. Sarah thanked her and hung up. She sat in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, trying to calculate scenarios that made sense. None of them did. Accepting the property meant taking on debt she could not afford. Declining it meant remaining where she was, in an apartment that grew smaller each year as Maya grew larger, in a situation that offered no path forward. She thought about her mother, who had died 3 years earlier after a brief illness that had consumed what little estate she had to leave. Her mother had worked 2 jobs for most of Sarah's childhood, maintaining a smile that Sarah only later recognized as exhaustion dressed in determination. That legacy, one of constant labor yielding minimal security, felt inescapable. Sarah had worked just as hard, been just as careful, and yet found herself in the same position. The cycle was perfect in its cruelty. The deadline approached with the steady inevitability of rent due dates and utility shutoff notices. Sarah spent her evenings after Maya went to sleep researching, trying to find information that would tip the balance toward a clear decision. She found property listings in Meridian Falls showing houses that sold for surprisingly little. $50,000 for a 3-bedroom home. $35,000 for a smaller structure. These were prices that would have been impossible in the city, but they still existed beyond her reach. A collapsed mansion, even acquired for $1, was not the same as a habitable home. She found forums where people discussed buying distressed properties, fixing them slowly over years. The advice was consistent. Location mattered. Structural integrity mattered. Access to utilities mattered. Without knowing any of these details, the risk was too great. One collapsed wall could mean foundation failure. Foundation failure could mean the entire structure was unsalvageable. Yet the idea would not release her. At night, she found herself imagining what it might look like. She pictured something old, Victorian perhaps, with high ceilings and large windows. She knew this was fantasy, the kind of wishful transformation that reality rarely permitted. More likely, it was a ruin. Walls caved in, roof gone, floors rotted through. A hazard waiting to injure whoever was foolish enough to approach it. But even a ruin was property. It was land. And land, she had learned from her research, held value separate from the structures built upon it. If the mansion truly was beyond repair, perhaps the land itself could be sold. Even a small lot in a struggling town might bring a few $1,000s. Enough to pay off some of the medical debt. Enough to move Maya out of the studio apartment and into something with 2 rooms. Enough to create a small margin between their life and the constant edge of collapse. The thought arrived with such sudden clarity that it felt like a plan rather than a hope. She would accept the property. She would assess it honestly, without illusion. If it could be sold, she would sell it. If it could not, she would surrender it to the county and walk away having lost nothing more than the filing fees and a day's drive. The risk was still significant, but it was bounded. She could see its edges. She called the law firm the next day and informed Ms. Brennan of her decision. The woman's response was brisk, almost relieved. She would prepare the paperwork. Sarah would need to sign in the presence of a notary and return the documents within 2 weeks. The filing fees, she was informed, would be $230. Sarah agreed, then spent that evening calculating how to acquire that amount without overdrawing her account. She picked up an extra shift at the call center. She sold a piece of jewelry she had kept from before the divorce, a necklace her ex-husband had given her during better years. It brought $60 from a pawn shop that offered less than she hoped, but more than she feared. She skipped lunches for a week, telling herself it was temporary, that once this was settled she would eat properly again. By the time the paperwork arrived, she had assembled the required amount. Signing the documents felt both momentous and mundane. The notary, a woman who worked in a shipping store, barely glanced at Sarah as she stamped and signed, her attention already moving to the next customer waiting in line. Sarah mailed the envelope and tried not to think about what she had just committed herself to. 3 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. This one contained a deed, official and formal, transferring ownership of the property at 47 Blackwood Lane from the estate to Sarah Elena Chen. She was now, legally and irrevocably, the owner of a condemned mansion she had never seen. The responses from those around her, once she began to share the news, followed a predictable pattern. Her co-worker Diane, who had worked at the call center longer than anyone else and carried the weary authority of someone who had seen every possible customer complaint, was the first to hear. Sarah mentioned it casually during a break, framing it as an oddity more than a plan. Diane's expression shifted from mild interest to open incredulity. "You bought a condemned building?" Diane's voice carried the flat disbelief of someone used to bad decisions, but still capable of being surprised by their scope. "For how much?" $1, Sarah said, "plus filing fees." Diane stared at her. "You spent $200 on paperwork for a building that's falling down?" "I inherited it," Sarah clarified, though she knew the distinction would not matter. It was either accept it or let it go to the county. "You should have let it go to the county," Diane said. The certainty in her voice was absolute. "They condemn buildings for a reason. That reason is they're dangerous. What are you going to do with it?" Sarah had no good answer. She offered something vague about assessing its condition, about possibly selling the land. Diane shook her head slowly, the gesture carrying more pity than judgment. "Land in a place like Meridian Falls isn't worth anything," she said. "You're going to drive 3 hours to look at rubble, and when you get there, you're going to realize you own a problem you can't afford to fix or walk away from." The conversation ended there, but its echo followed Sarah through the rest of her shift. Diane's assessment was not cruel. It was pragmatic, rooted in the kind of hard-earned realism that came from watching people make optimistic decisions only to have them collapse under the weight of unforeseen complications. Sarah could not argue with that experience. She could only hope it would not apply to her. Her landlord's reaction was worse. She mentioned the property casually when delivering her rent check, intending it as neutral information, perhaps even as a precursor to eventual notice that she would be leaving. Mr. Patel, who managed the building with a combination of negligence and suspicion, latched onto the detail immediately. "You're moving?" His tone carried accusation rather than curiosity. "I'm considering it," Sarah said carefully. "I don't know yet. The property needs evaluation. Your lease doesn't end for 4 months." Mr. Patel's eyes narrowed. "If you break it, you forfeit the deposit. You understand that?" "I understand." Sarah kept her voice even. The deposit had been $800, paid 2 years earlier when she and Maya had first moved in. That money was as theoretical now as any savings account. She had no expectation of ever seeing it again. Leases in buildings like this were designed to extract maximum revenue while minimizing landlord responsibility. Breaking one would simply accelerate the inevitable loss. "A condemned building," Mr. Patel continued, shaking his head. "You're going to spend money fixing something that's already been declared worthless. Meanwhile, you have a perfectly good apartment here." Sarah did not respond. The apartment was not perfectly good. It was adequate at best, deteriorating steadily at worst. But arguing would achieve nothing. She thanked Mr. Patel for his time and left before the conversation could deepen into territory that would make the next 4 months even more uncomfortable. Her sister called that evening, having heard about the inheritance from Sarah's brief mention of it during their weekly check-in. Lisa lived across the country, in a suburb where homes had yards and schools had funding. Her life had taken a different trajectory, one built on better choices and better luck. She had married someone reliable. She had a career that offered benefits and stability. Her concern for Sarah was genuine, but was also tinged with the kind of incomprehension that came from never having faced true financial precarity. A condemned mansion, Lisa repeated, her voice carrying the upward lilt of someone trying to find the angle that made sense. That's so random. Did you know this cousin well? No, Sarah said. I met her twice, and she left you a condemned building. Lisa laughed, though the sound was more bewildered than amused. That's kind of a strange thing to inherit. It was the only thing to inherit, Sarah explained. She didn't have anything else. So why not just let the county take it? Why accept liability for something you can't use? Sarah had asked herself the same question repeatedly. The answer remained elusive, shaped more by desperation than logic. I thought maybe the land would be worth something, she said. Even if the building is gone, the lot itself might sell. Lisa was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, becoming the careful gentleness of someone preparing to deliver uncomfortable advice. Sarah, you know I love you. But this sounds like one of those situations where you're hoping for the best when you should be preparing for the worst. Condemned buildings don't turn into opportunities. They turn into money pits. I don't have money to put into a pit, Sarah said, more sharply than she intended. I'm aware of that. Then why are you doing this? Because I don't have anything else. The words came out quietly, but they carried finality. I can't afford to stay here long term. Maya's getting older. We can't share a studio apartment forever. This might be nothing, but nothing is where I already am. At least this way, I'm trying. Lisa sighed. I get that. I do. But trying doesn't always mean things work out. Sometimes it just means you've traded one problem for a different one. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, Sarah said. Right now, I need to see what I'm working with. They ended the call with promises to talk again soon, but Sarah felt the distance between them more acutely than usual. Lisa meant well. They all meant well. But meaning well was easy when your own foundation was secure. Advice from stability always sounded like judgment when you were drowning. The final conversation that week came from Maya herself. The girl had been quieter than usual, watching Sarah with the kind of careful attention children develop when they sense something is wrong but don't know how to ask about it. One evening, as Sarah prepared their simple dinner of pasta and canned sauce, Maya spoke from the small table where she was coloring. Are we moving? Her voice was small, uncertain. Sarah paused, the wooden spoon motionless in her hand. Maybe, she said. I don't know yet. Where? To a town called Meridian Falls. It's a few hours away. Maya considered this, her crayon moving slowly across the page. Is it because of the house? Yes. Sarah kept her voice gentle. I inherited a house from someone in the family, but it needs a lot of work. I have to go see it first to decide if we can live there. Is it big? I think so, but it's old and damaged. It might not be safe. Maya nodded slowly, as though this information fit into a category she already understood. Is that why people said it was a bad idea? Sarah turned, surprised. Who said that? I heard you talking on the phone. Maya's eyes remained on her drawing, but her shoulders had tensed. Someone said you shouldn't have bought it. Sarah set down the spoon and crossed to the table, kneeling beside her daughter. She placed a hand gently on Maya's back. A lot of people think it's a bad idea, she admitted. They might be right, but I want to try anyway, because if it works out, we could have more space. You could have your own room. Maya looked up then, her expression unreadable. But if it doesn't work out, then we'll stay here, or find somewhere else. We'll figure it out. Like we always do. The phrase struck Sarah harder than she expected. Maya had heard her say it countless times, usually late at night when bills piled higher than anticipated, when the car made concerning sounds, when unexpected expenses appeared like ambushes. We'll figure it out. It was her mantra, her reassurance, the thing she repeated until it sounded almost true. And Maya, paying closer attention than Sarah had realized, had absorbed it as a fundamental truth of their existence. They would figure it out because they always had to. Yes, Sarah said quietly. Like we always do. Maya returned to her coloring, apparently satisfied. Sarah stood and went back to the stove, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of preparing dinner, while her mind remained fixed on the weight of her daughter's trust. That trust was the most valuable thing she had, and the most terrifying. It was also the reason she could not afford to fail at this, no matter how improbable success seemed. The drive to Meridian Falls took place on a Saturday morning in early autumn. Sarah had arranged for Diane to watch Maya, framing the trip as a quick assessment that wouldn't require an overnight stay. She left early, the streets still dim and quiet, the city slowly shedding the last remnants of darkness as she merged onto the highway, heading west. The landscape changed gradually. Urban density gave way to suburbs, then to smaller towns, then to stretches of open land broken by occasional clusters of development. By the time she reached the turnoff for Meridian Falls, the road had narrowed to 2 lanes, and the traffic had thinned to a scattering of pickup trucks and sedans whose occupants drove with the unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. The town appeared without announcement, its boundaries marked only by a faded sign that welcomed visitors and listed the names of service organizations that met on Wednesdays. The main street resembled the photographs Sarah had seen online, but reality added textures the images had concealed. The brick buildings were weathered, their facades marked by decades of sun and rain. Several storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. Those that remained open, a diner, a hardware store, a secondhand shop, bore hand-painted signs that spoke to local ownership rather than corporate chains. She drove slowly, following the directions her phone provided with mechanical precision. Blackwood Lane was on the eastern edge of town, past the modest residential streets where small homes sat on tidy lots. The pavement grew rougher as she continued, patched repeatedly but never resurfaced, until finally the road curved and the landscape opened slightly to reveal larger properties separated by greater distances. Number 47 appeared on the left, though no mailbox marked it clearly. Sarah knew it was the right place because of the structure that loomed behind a row of overgrown trees. Even partially obscured, its shape was unmistakable. This was not a modest home. This was something that had once been grand. She pulled onto the gravel driveway, or what remained of it, and parked. For a moment, she simply sat in the car, hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at what she had inherited. The mansion rose 3 stories, its architecture speaking to an era that had favored height and ornamentation. Or at least, it had risen 3 stories. The left side of the structure had collapsed inward, its walls leaning at angles that defied stability. The roof sagged in the middle, sections of it missing entirely, exposing dark gaps where rooms once existed. Windows on the intact portions were broken or boarded, and the entire building bore the gray, lifeless color of neglect that had extended beyond years into decades. The front facade, miraculously, remained partially standing. A wide porch stretched across it, though many of its boards had rotted through. 2 columns that might once have framed an impressive entrance now tilted, their bases crumbled, their surfaces streaked with water damage. The main door hung slightly ajar, held in place by a single hinge that looked ready to surrender its grip at any moment. Sarah stepped out of the car slowly. The air here was cooler than in the city, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Overgrown grass surrounded the structure, interspersed with weeds that had grown tall enough to brush against the porch edge. There were no other houses visible from here. The neighboring properties, if they existed, were shielded by distance and trees. Silence pressed in around her, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint creak of wood shifting somewhere within the structure. She had expected to feel disappointment, perhaps anger at having wasted time and money on this. Instead, what she felt was a strange, hollow awe. This was not just a ruined building. It was a monument to scale she had never owned, never imagined owning. She walked toward the porch, each step deliberate, testing the ground before committing her weight. The stairs leading up were partially collapsed, forcing her to navigate around them and step directly onto the porch from the side. The boards beneath her feet groaned but held. She moved carefully toward the door, aware that at any moment the structure could shift in a way that made retreat impossible. Through the gap where the door hung open, she could see into what had once been an entrance hall. The floor was covered in debris, fallen plaster, broken wood, fragments of things she could not immediately identify. Shafts of light entered through gaps in the roof, creating isolated pools of illumination that made the darkness around them seem deeper. The walls still bore traces of wallpaper, faded and peeling, patterns that might once have been elegant now reduced to ghostly suggestions. Sarah did not enter. Not yet. She circled the exterior instead, moving clockwise around the structure, cataloging damage with the careful attention of someone trying to understand the full scope of what she faced. The collapse on the left side was catastrophic. Walls had buckled and fallen, taking portions of the second and third floors with them. The rubble formed a chaotic pile of brick, wood, and twisted metal that would take weeks to clear even if she had the equipment and labor to attempt it. The back of the mansion was slightly better preserved. A series of smaller additions extended from the main structure, perhaps servant quarters or storage areas. Some of these remained mostly intact, their roofs still in place, their walls standing. She found a rear door that was locked but less damaged than the front entrance. Through its single small window, she glimpsed a kitchen that looked like it had been abandoned mid-use, its counters still bearing the outlines of long-removed objects, its cabinets hanging open like mouths frozen in surprise. The right side of the structure mirrored the left in general shape, though the damage here was less severe. Windows remained unbroken on the upper floor, suggesting some internal integrity still existed. She could see the suggestion of rooms through those windows, empty spaces that spoke to lives once lived here, routines once maintained, a household that had functioned before whatever series of failures led to this collapse. By the time she completed her circuit and returned to the front, Sarah felt the full weight of what she had accepted. This was beyond repair in any conventional sense. The cost to demolish it safely would likely exceed the value of the land. The fines mentioned in the letter were laughably inadequate measures of the actual problem. This was a liability that would consume any resource she directed toward it and demand more. And yet, standing there in the overgrown yard, looking at the tilted columns and the sagging roof, Sarah felt something she had not expected. Not hope exactly, but its distant cousin. Possibility. Not the possibility of restoration. That was fantasy. But the possibility of transformation. The raw materials of this structure, if nothing else, represented volume. Hundreds of bricks. Countless board feet of lumber. Much of it old-growth wood that was rare now. Metal fixtures. Stone foundations. These were not worthless, even in their ruined state. She thought suddenly of Maya's question. Is it big? Yes, she could answer now. It was big. Impossibly big. Absurdly big for someone in her position. And in that absurdity lay the seed of something she could not yet name. Because no one else wanted this. No one else would take it. Which meant, for the first time in her adult life, she possessed something that was entirely her own, unencumbered by debt to anyone except the municipality that wanted its fines paid. The sun had climbed higher while she explored. Sarah checked her phone and saw that she had been here for nearly 2 hours. Time, she realized, moved differently when you were trying to comprehend something that resisted easy categorization. She needed to return to the city, to Maya, to the remainder of the weekend that would dissolve back into work on Monday. But leaving felt premature, as though she had not yet extracted the essential understanding this place demanded. She approached the front door again, this time allowing herself to cross the threshold. The interior was dark despite the gaps in the roof. Her eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a space that was larger than her entire apartment. The floor was covered in debris, but beneath it she could see wood planks that, in sections, remained surprisingly intact. The staircase that must have once curved upward to the second floor was partially collapsed, its railings gone, several steps missing. But its structure remained visible, suggesting how it had once functioned, how people had moved through this space with the casual familiarity of home. To her left, a doorway opened into what might have been a parlor or sitting room. The ceiling there had partially fallen, but the walls stood, and she could see the remnants of a fireplace, its mantel still attached, its opening dark and deep. To her right, Another doorway led toward the back, presumably connecting to the kitchen she had glimpsed from outside. Between these spaces, the entrance hall stretched like a transitional void, neither inside nor outside, waiting for someone to decide its purpose. Sarah took a single step further in, testing the floor. It held. She took another step, then another, until she stood in the center of the hall. From this vantage, the scale became even more apparent. This was a building designed for a life she had never known. Multi-generational families, staff, social gatherings that required space to accommodate dozens of people. The wealth required to build such a place, even a century ago, would have been substantial. And now it sat empty, collapsing slowly, its grandeur reduced to a hazard that no one wanted to address. Something crunched beneath her foot. She looked down and saw a small object half buried in plaster dust. She knelt carefully, brushing away debris, and lifted it into the light, filtering through the damaged roof. It was a doorknob, ornate and heavy, its brass surface tarnished, but still revealing intricate detailing beneath the patina. She turned it in her hand, feeling its weight, imagining it attached to a door that had long since rotted away. This small object, functional and beautiful, had been crafted with care by someone who understood that even utilitarian items could carry aesthetic value. How many such details existed within this ruin, buried and forgotten? She slipped the doorknob into her pocket, an impulsive gesture she did not fully examine. Then she stood and made her way carefully back to the entrance. Outside, the sunlight fell harsh after the dim interior. She pulled the door closed as much as its damaged hinge allowed, knowing it was a futile gesture, but compelled to do it anyway. As she walked back to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Maya is fine. Asking when. You'll be back. Sarah typed a quick response, then paused before sending it. She looked up at the mansion once more, taking in its full, ruined profile against the clear sky. She had driven 3 hours to see this. She had inherited a problem that everyone told her to abandon. She had no plan, no resources, no expertise that would transform this wreckage into anything useful. And yet, as she stood there, hand on her car door, she felt something solidify within her. Not certainty, not confidence, but commitment. She would not walk away from this. She would not let it go without understanding what it truly held. The drive back to the city passed in silence. Sarah did not turn on the radio. She simply drove, her thoughts circling the same questions without arriving at answers. What would she do with it? How would she afford even the minimum intervention? Where would she find the knowledge required to determine next steps? By the time she reached the apartment and collected Maya from Diane's, exhaustion had settled into her bones. Maya chattered about her day, about the game she had played, about something funny Diane's cat had done. Sarah listened with half her attention, the other half still walking through the ruined entrance hall, still standing in the overgrown yard, still feeling the weight of the brass door knob in her pocket. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table and opened her laptop. She began searching for information about property salvage, about selling architectural elements, about the market for reclaimed materials. The answers she found were mixed. Yes, there was a market. Yes, old-growth lumber had value. Yes, period fixtures could sell for surprising amounts. But the effort required to extract, clean, and transport such materials was substantial. And without proper equipment or expertise, the risk of injury was significant. She found forums where people discussed similar projects. Their stories ranged from triumphant transformations to cautionary tales of financial ruin. The consistent theme was that success required either substantial capital or substantial time. Usually both. She had neither. What she had was desperation dressed as determination, and the fading echo of Maya's small voice asking, "Is it big?" Yes, Sarah thought, closing the laptop as midnight approached. It's big. Too big. Impossibly big. And somehow, that was going to have to be enough. The second visit came 2 weeks later, driven by necessity rather than curiosity. The county had sent a letter, official and terse, informing Sarah that the property at 47 Blackwood Lane was in violation of multiple codes and that immediate action was required. The fines had increased to $2,000 and a deadline loomed. Within 60 days, the structure must be either demolished or brought into minimal compliance. Failure to act would result in additional penalties and potential foreclosure to recover municipal costs. Sarah read the letter 3 times, each pass failing to make the situation less impossible. $2,000. 60 days. The words felt like weights dropping onto an already unstable foundation. She had no savings. Her credit cards were maxed. The idea of borrowing that amount from anyone she knew was laughable. Her sister had her own family to support. Diane worked the same job Sarah did, living paycheck to paycheck with even less margin for error. Demolition, she learned through frantic online research, would cost tens of thousands of dollars for a structure this size. Professional contractors who specialized in condemned buildings quoted figures that started at $40,000 and climbed higher once they understood the scope. Bringing the property into compliance, even minimal compliance, would require structural assessments, engineering reports, permits, and repairs that would dwarf the demolition costs. She was trapped in a scenario she should have anticipated, but somehow had not fully comprehended. The property was not an asset. It was a debt that grew larger the longer it existed. Walking away was no longer free. She had accepted ownership. Her name was on the deed. The county did not care about her inability to pay. They simply wanted the problem resolved, and she was now legally responsible for resolving it. The desperation that followed was not dramatic. It did not arrive as a sudden crisis, but as a steady tightening, like a rope slowly drawn around her chest. She worked extra shifts when they were available, but the call center had no shortage of employees willing to do the same. She sold what little she owned that had any resale value. A laptop that was 3 years old brought $120. Books, clothes, a small television Maya rarely watched. These disappeared into secondhand shops for amounts so small they felt insulting. By the end of the first week, she had gathered $400. It was nowhere near enough. Maya noticed, of course. Children always noticed. She did not ask directly, but her behavior shifted. She ate even less, leaving more on her plate. She stopped mentioning things she saw at school that other children had. She grew quieter at night, her usual questions fading into silence. Sarah recognized these patterns. They were the same ones she had exhibited as a child when her mother struggled. The quiet retreat of a young person learning that their needs were a burden. One evening, Sarah found Maya drawing at the small table, her crayons moving slowly across a page. When Sarah looked over her daughter's shoulder, she saw that Maya had drawn a house. Not the apartment. A house with multiple windows, a door in the center, a yard suggested by green scribbles along the bottom. Above it, Maya had written in careful, uneven letters, "Our house." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not cleanly, not all at once, but with the slow fracture of something that had been holding too much weight for too long. She knelt beside Maya and pulled her close, holding her daughter with a fierceness that surprised them both. Maya did not ask what was wrong. She simply leaned into her mother, her small hands gripping Sarah's shirt, and they stayed that way until the moment passed, and Sarah could breathe again without the threat of tears. The second trip to Meridian Falls happened on a Sunday, the only full day Sarah could manage to take without losing necessary income. She left Maya with Diane again, promising to be back before evening. The drive felt longer this time, weighted by the knowledge of what she faced. She was not going to explore. She was going to confront the reality that everyone had warned her about. The mansion looked worse in morning light. The collapse on the left side seemed more pronounced, as though the structure had settled further into its own destruction during the 2 weeks since her last visit. The boards on the porch appeared grayer, more brittle. When she stepped onto them, they creaked with a sound that felt like protest. This time, Sarah came, prepared. She wore sturdy boots borrowed from Diane, work gloves purchased from a dollar store, and carried a flashlight that was heavy enough to suggest durability. She had brought a crowbar as well, not with any clear plan, but with the vague notion that she might need to move debris or force open doors that were stuck. In her pocket was a small notebook and a pen. If nothing else, she would document what was here before it disappeared entirely. She entered through the front door again, more confident in her movements now that she understood the floor's remaining stability. The debris had not changed. The plaster dust still covered everything in a fine, pale layer. But the light was different today, entering at sharper angles, revealing details she had missed during her first visit. She moved toward the parlor on the left, stepping carefully through the doorway. The room was larger than she remembered. Its proportions revealed more clearly now that her eyes had adjusted. The fallen ceiling had created a mound of rubble in the center, but the perimeter remained relatively clear. She could see the outline of where furniture had once stood, faded rectangles on the floor where carpets had protected the wood, deeper shadows on the walls where paintings or mirrors had hung. The fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved from dark wood that had survived remarkably well. She approached it, running her gloved hand over the surface. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Detailed scrollwork, floral patterns, faces of cherubs or angels rendered in miniature. This was not mass-produced decoration. Someone had carved this by hand, spending hours, perhaps weeks, creating beauty that was meant to last generations. She thought about the doorknob in her pocket from her first visit, the one she had taken on impulse. Objects like that, architectural salvage dealers called them. She had done more research since then, learning that period mantels could sell for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars, depending on condition and provenance. This one was damaged in places, but largely intact. If she could remove it, if she could transport it safely, it might bring enough to pay a small portion of the fines. The idea felt simultaneously practical and grotesque. She was standing in the wreckage of someone's home, considering how to dismantle it for parts. Yet the alternative was to let the county demolish everything, grinding these carefully crafted objects in a landfill material. At least this way, some element of the original structure might survive, preserved in someone else's restored home. She continued through the parlor, finding a doorway that led to an adjoining room. This one had been a library or study. Built-in bookshelves lined two walls, their shelves empty but their structure sound. The wood here was different, lighter in color, possibly oak. She tested one shelf, pulling gently. It held firm, attached to the wall with joinery that had survived decades of neglect. These shelves, too, had value. But removing them would require tools she did not have and knowledge she did not possess. At the far end of the library, she found another door, this one closed. She tried the handle. Locked. The mechanism was stiff with age and moisture, but it held. She considered using the crowbar to force it, then hesitated. Breaking a door felt like crossing a line she could not quite define. The mansion was hers legally, yet damaging it deliberately felt wrong, as though she were betraying some implicit trust. Instead, she returned to the entrance hall and made her way toward the back of the house, following the path she had glimpsed during her first visit. The corridor leading to the kitchen was narrow and dark, its ceiling intact but water-stained. She used her flashlight to navigate, its beam cutting through shadows that seemed to resist illumination. The kitchen was exactly as she remembered seeing it through the window. Larger than modern kitchens, designed for a household that had employed staff. The counters were old porcelain and cast iron, surfaces that had once been pristine but were now cracked and stained. Cabinets hung open, their contents long removed, their interiors showing faint outlines where dishes and cookware had once been stored. She searched the cabinets methodically, not expecting to find anything but compelled to be thorough. Most were empty. In one, she found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, their dates reaching back 30 years. She lifted them carefully, scanning headlines that spoke of local events and concerns that felt distant now. A school bond measure, a county fair, a debate about zoning regulations. The ordinary documentation of a community's life, preserved accidentally in a forgotten cabinet. In another cabinet, lower and more accessible, she found something that made her pause. A small metal box, its surface rusted, but its structure intact. She pulled it out carefully and set it on the counter. The lid was not locked, merely stuck. She worked it gently, applying pressure until it gave way with a soft pop. Inside were documents. Papers folded and yellowed, their edges brittle. She lifted them into the flashlight beam and unfolded the first one carefully. It was a property deed, dated 1924, transferring ownership of 47 Blackwood Lane to a man named Lawrence Blackwood. The amount paid was listed $40,000. In 1924, she knew from her historical research that was a fortune. She set that document aside and examined the next. A letter, handwritten in elegant script, addressed to Lawrence Blackwood from someone named Margaret. The content was personal, domestic. Margaret was writing about progress on the house's construction, about difficulties finding craftsmen skilled enough to execute Lawrence's designs, about her excitement at finally having a home that matched their growing prosperity. Sarah read the letter twice, feeling the strange intimacy of encountering someone's private correspondence a century later. Margaret's voice came through clearly despite the archaic phrasing. She was excited, yes, but also anxious. The house was expensive. The construction was taking longer than anticipated. She worried about whether they were overextending themselves, whether such grandeur was necessary. The next document was a construction invoice, itemized and detailed. Materials for the grand staircase, $1,200. Labor for the plasterwork, $800. Installation of the parlor fireplace, $300. On the items continued, each representing a decision made, a craftsman hired, money spent with the confidence that it would be worth the investment. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding as she read through these documents. This mansion was not just a building. It was a deliberate creation designed to embody ambition and permanence. Lawrence and Margaret Blackwood had built this place to last, to house not just themselves but generations of their family. They had chosen quality over economy, beauty over mere function. Every carved mantel, every custom doorknob, every built-in bookshelf represented that choice. And now it was collapsing into ruin, its grandeur reduced to a municipal code violation. The irony was bitter. Everything the Blackwoods had built to last had lasted just long enough to become someone else's problem. She returned the documents to the box, closing it carefully. This, too, had value, not monetary but historical. These papers told a story, provided context that would matter to someone. She tucked the box under her arm, claiming it as she had claimed the doorknob. Small salvages from a wreck that was too large to save. As she turned to leave the kitchen, her flashlight beam swept across the floor and caught something she had not noticed before. A seam in the floorboards, too regular to be a gap between planks. She crouched, examining it more closely. The line formed a rectangle, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, its edges filled with decades of dirt, but still visible. A trapdoor. It had to be. She traced the seam with her finger, finding a small recessed ring on one side, nearly invisible beneath grime. She pulled at it, but the door did not budge. Age and moisture had swollen the wood, sealing it tight. She tried again, applying more force, and this time felt the slightest give, a suggestion that with enough effort it might open. Sarah sat back on her heels, breathing harder than the exertion warranted. A basement, or a root cellar. Mansions of this era often had them, spaces designed for storage before modern refrigeration existed. She had not thought about what might lie beneath the structure, had not considered that the mansion's secrets might extend below ground as well as above. She looked at her watch. 2 hours had passed since she arrived. She needed to return soon to collect Maya. But the idea of leaving now, without knowing what lay beneath that trapdoor, felt impossible. She attacked it with renewed determination, using the crowbar to pry gently at the edges, working around the perimeter until she heard a crack, wood separating from wood, the seal breaking. The door lifted with resistance, its hinges protesting. Dust rose in a cloud as she heaved it fully open, revealing darkness below. She aimed her flashlight down and saw steps, wooden and steep, descending into a space that her light could not fully penetrate. The air that rose from below was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something faintly metallic. Sarah hesitated. Going down there alone, without telling anyone where she was, violated every safety principle she knew. If the stairs collapsed, if she were injured, no one would find her until it was too late. And yet the pull was undeniable. She had come here to understand what she owned, and understanding required looking where others had not bothered to look. She descended carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The stairs were more solid than she expected, the wood dry despite the dampness of the air. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight revealed a space that was smaller than the house above, but still substantial. A basement, as she had suspected, with a ceiling just tall enough for her to stand upright. The walls were stone, likely original to the structure's foundation. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of compression. And along the walls, wooden shelves and crates were stacked with the same careful order she had seen throughout the house. The Blackwoods, it seemed, had not been casual about any aspect of their property, even the spaces hidden from view. She approached the nearest shelf, her flashlight beam illuminating rows of glass jars. Most were empty, their contents long consumed or evaporated. A few still held remnants of preserved foods, their contents unrecognizable now, darkened by time into uniform masses. She moved past these, finding tools hung on pegs along another wall. Shovels, pickaxes, implements whose purposes she could not immediately identify. All were old, their metal surfaces pitted with rust, but none had been carelessly discarded. Someone had maintained this space, keeping it organized even when the house above began to fail. At the far end of the basement, she found something that made her slow her approach. A section of wall that looked different from the rest. The stones here were smaller, more uniform, fitted together with a precision that suggested different construction. And in the center of this section, barely visible beneath decades of dust and cobwebs, was a door. Not a wooden door like those upstairs, but metal. Small, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. It sat low to the ground, requiring one to crouch to access it. Its surface was dark, possibly iron, and across its face was a simple locking mechanism, a heavy bar that slid into brackets on either side. Sarah's heart rate increased as she approached it. This was not a standard basement feature. This was something else, something added deliberately, designed to secure whatever lay beyond. She brushed away cobwebs and dust, revealing more of the door's surface. No markings, no labels, just solid metal and the bar lock. She reached for the bar and found it moved more easily than she expected. It was well made, its mechanism simple but effective. She slid it free of its brackets and pushed against the door. It did not budge. She pushed harder, applying her shoulder to it, and felt the slightest movement. The hinges, like those on a trapdoor above, had been sealed by time. She used the crowbar, leveraging it against the door's edge, and was rewarded with a sharp crack as the seal broke. The door swung inward with surprising smoothness, and beyond it lay not a room but a tunnel. Her flashlight beams stretched into darkness, revealing walls that were stone like the basement, but more carefully constructed. This was not rough foundation work. This was deliberate architecture, built with the same attention to quality as the house above. Sarah stepped through the doorway and into the tunnel. The air here was different, cooler still, drier. The tunnel extended straight ahead, its ceiling arched slightly, its floor level. She walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly. After perhaps 30 feet, the tunnel ended at another door, this one wooden but reinforced with metal bands. She tried the handle. Unlocked. It opened easily, as though it had been used more recently than the basement entrance. Beyond it was a room that stopped Sarah in her tracks. It was not large, perhaps 15 feet square, but every surface was lined with shelves. And on those shelves, stacked with the same meticulous care she had seen throughout the property, were boxes. Dozens of them, all identical in size, all made of heavy wood, all sealed. Sarah approached the nearest shelf and lifted one of the boxes. It was heavier than she expected, dense with whatever it contained. She set it on the floor and examined it more closely. No markings on the outside, no indication of contents. The lid was not nailed shut but fitted tightly, held in place by small metal clasps that opened easily once she understood their mechanism. She lifted the lid and aimed her flashlight inside. As she stopped breathing, the box was filled with coins. Not modern coins, but old ones, their surfaces dull by time, but unmistakably precious. She lifted one carefully, turning it in the light. Gold. It had to be. The weight, the color, the faint markings visible beneath decades of tarnish, all suggested gold coins, possibly from the early 20th century. She set that coin down and opened another box. More coins, these smaller, silver perhaps. Another box held paper currency, bills so old they looked like artifacts from a museum. The denominations were large, hundreds, thousands. She could not tell if they were still valid, but the sheer quantity suggested enormous value. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the boxes and sat back, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. This was not a random discovery. This was not a small cache hidden by paranoid owners. This was systematic wealth storage, organized and preserved with the same care the Blackwoods had applied to everything else. She stood and began counting the boxes. 3 shelves, each holding 12 boxes. 36 in total. If each box held even a fraction of what the first few contained, the value would be staggering. She felt dizzy, the small room seeming to tilt around her. This was not salvage. This was not architectural elements she could sell to pay fines. This was a fortune. She forced herself to think clearly, to move past the shock and into assessment. Why had this remained hidden? Why had no one found it? The answer, once she considered it, was obvious. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to collapse slowly. The cousin who had inherited it had been elderly, possibly unaware of what lay beneath the structure. Or perhaps aware, but unable to access it, choosing to leave it hidden rather than attempt recovery. And now it was hers. Legally, irrevocably, impossibly hers. Sarah's mind raced through implications. She could pay the fines. She could pay off her debts. She could move Maya into a real home, not just a temporary apartment, but something permanent, something safe. The medical bills that had haunted her for years could disappear in a single payment. For the first time since Maya's birth, she could imagine a life that was not defined by scarcity. But beneath the euphoria, caution asserted itself. This discovery changed everything, yes, but it also complicated everything. Gold and old currency were not like cash. They required authentication, sale through legitimate channels, explanations of provenance. The IRS would want to know about sudden wealth. Banks would ask questions. People would notice when a single mother working at a call center suddenly had resources that matched no reasonable narrative. And the mansion itself remained a problem. The county still wanted action. The structure still violated codes. Revealing the existence of this vault would invite scrutiny she could not afford, questions about what else might be hidden, investigations that would delay access to the funds and possibly result in legal challenges over ownership. She needed to move carefully. She needed to understand the full scope of what was here, to document it, to develop a plan that would allow her to claim this wealth without triggering the kind of attention that would destroy the opportunity before she could seize it. Sarah closed the wooden door to the vault room and returned through the tunnel to the basement. She climbed the stairs and emerged back into the kitchen, closing the trapdoor behind her. The metal box with the documents sat where she had left it. She picked it up, tucking it under her arm again. Outside, the sunlight seemed too bright, the ordinary world too immediate after the darkness of the basement. She loaded the box in her car and stood for a moment, looking back at the mansion. It no longer appeared as a ruin. It appeared as something else entirely. A shell protecting a secret. A problem concealing a solution. The drive back to the city passed in a blur of calculation. She thought about who she could trust, who had expertise she needed. She thought about timing, about how long she could delay the county without triggering foreclosure. She thought about Maya, about the drawing of a house, about the quiet hope her daughter carried without complaint. By the time she reached the city and collected Maya from Diane's, Sarah had made several decisions. First, she would tell no one about the vault. Not Diane, not her sister, not anyone who might ask questions she could not answer satisfactorily. Second, she would begin documenting the contents systematically, photographing each box, cataloging what she found. Third, she would research the proper channels for selling gold and old currency, finding dealers who specialized in estate liquidation and would ask minimal questions. And fourth, most importantly, she would buy time. She would contact the county and request an extension, claiming she was in the process of arranging demolition but needed additional time to secure contractors and financing. Bureaucracies, she had learned, moved slowly and responded well to language that suggested compliance was forthcoming, even if that compliance never actually arrived. That night, after Maya had gone to sleep, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table and opened her laptop. She began searching, her query specific and focused. Gold coin values, currency authentication, estate liquidation specialists, legal considerations for inherited wealth. Each search revealed new layers of complexity, new challenges she would need to navigate. But beneath the complexity was a foundation that had not existed before. She had found something that no one expected to exist. She had inherited not just a problem, but its solution, hidden beneath layers of decay and neglect. The mansion everyone had told her to abandon had been protecting something worth abandoning everything else to claim. The irony was not lost on her. The Blackwoods had built their mansion to last, and it had, just barely, just long enough. Long enough for the house to collapse enough to be worthless. Long enough for the family line to fade until only a distant cousin remained. Long enough for that cousin to pass it to someone desperate enough to accept it despite every reasonable argument against doing so. Sarah thought about Margaret Blackwood's letter, about her anxiety over whether the house was too grand, whether they were overextending themselves. Margaret had worried about the cost of building something beautiful. She could not have imagined that a century later, that beauty would have collapsed, but the foundation beneath it would hold something far more valuable than the structure above. The following week, Sarah returned to Meridian Falls twice, both times claiming she was working extra shifts, when in fact she was driving 3 hours to spend stolen hours in the mansion's basement. She brought better equipment, a powerful LED lantern, a digital camera, a notebook with numbered pages. She descended into the vault room and began her systematic documentation. Each box was opened, photographed, its contents cataloged. The coins varied in denomination and origin. Some were American gold eagles, others were silver dollars. The paper currency ranged from the mundane to the rare, with several bills bearing denominations that were no longer printed. She found bonds as well, savings bonds issued decades ago, their maturity dates long past. Whether they still held value was uncertain, but their face amounts were substantial. As she worked, a pattern emerged. The Blackwoods had been methodical about their wealth storage. The coins were organized by type and denomination. The currency was bundled by amount. Everything suggested a mind that valued order, that had taken the time to preserve wealth with the expectation that it might be needed urgently, but would hopefully remain untouched for generations. Sarah estimated conservatively that the vault held at least several $100,000 in precious metals alone. The paper currency and bonds, if they retained any value, could double or triple that amount. The exact figure would depend on authentication and market conditions, but even her most pessimistic calculation placed the total well into 6 figures, possibly 7. The knowledge sat with her like a weight, heavy and uncomfortable. She went to work each day, answered calls from frustrated customers, apologized for problems she did not create and could not fix, all while knowing that beneath a collapsing mansion 3 hours away lay enough wealth to free her from this life entirely. The contrast was disorienting, almost surreal. Maya noticed her distraction, but interpreted it differently than Sarah feared. One evening, as they ate their simple dinner, Maya asked, "Are you thinking about the house?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. There was no point in lying. "Are we going to live there?" Sarah paused, fork halfway to her mouth. The question was simple, but its implications were vast. She had been thinking about the money, about what it could buy, about how it would change their circumstances. But Maya, with the straightforward logic of childhood, was thinking about the thing that had started this entire sequence. The house itself. Maybe, Sarah said carefully. It needs a lot of work. But maybe. I think it would be good, Maya said. Her voice was quiet but certain. Even if it's broken, it's ours. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Even if it's broken, it's ours. The phrase captured something Sarah had been unable to articulate. The mansion was broken, yes. Dangerously so. But it was theirs in a way nothing else had ever been. Not rented, not borrowed, not subject to someone else's rules. Theirs. And now, because of what lay hidden beneath it, it represented not just ownership, but possibility. That night, Sarah made a new list. Not of what she needed to survive the next month, but of what she needed to build the life Maya deserved. The money from the vault would require careful handling, careful timing, careful explanation. But once secured, it could provide things Sarah had never imagined being able to offer. A home, yes, but also education savings. Medical care without the terror of bills. Room to breathe, to plan beyond the immediate crisis, to make choices based on what was best rather than what was merely survivable. She began researching coin dealers, starting with those who specialized in estate purchases. She crafted inquiries carefully, presenting herself as someone who had inherited a modest collection and wanted to understand its value before deciding whether to sell. The responses varied. Some dealers were dismissive, others overly eager in ways that suggested they sensed inexperience and saw opportunity to underpay. Eventually, she found one whose correspondence seemed both professional and fair. A firm in the city, established 40 years earlier, with online reviews that emphasized honest appraisals and transparent pricing. She scheduled an appointment, claiming she wanted to bring in a few pieces for evaluation. The dealer, a man named Richard Morse, agreed without pressing for details. Sarah selected 3 coins from the vault, representative samples, not the most valuable, but substantial enough to establish that this was legitimate wealth, not trinkets. She wrapped them carefully and placed them in a small padded envelope. When the appointment day arrived, she took a personal day from work, the first she had taken in over a year, and drove to the dealer's location. The shop was smaller than she expected, tucked between a coffee roaster and a bookstore on a street that had clearly been revitalized recently. Inside, the space was dim and cluttered with display cases containing coins, metals, and currency from various eras. Richard Morse emerged from a back room, an older man with careful hands and the kind of unhurried demeanor that suggested he had learned patience over decades. Sarah introduced herself and handed over the envelope. Mr. Morse opened it with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times. He removed the coins, examined each one briefly, then looked up at Sarah with an expression that had shifted from polite interest to genuine attention. "Where did you acquire these?" His tone was not accusatory, merely curious. "I inherited them," Sarah said. "It was the truth, or enough of it, from a distant relative. I'm trying to understand what they're worth." Mr. Morse nodded and took the coins to a workstation, where he examined them under magnification and tested them with tools Sarah did not recognize. The process took perhaps 15 minutes. When he returned to the counter where Sarah waited, his expression was neutral, but his eyes held something she could not quite read. "These are authentic," he said. "Early 20th century American gold coins, well preserved despite some age-related tarnishing. The current spot price of gold makes each of these worth approximately $1,200 in precious metal content alone. However, their numismatic value, the value to collectors based on rarity and condition, is higher. I would estimate each coin at around $1,800 in the current market." Sarah did quick mental math. 3 coins, $5,400. And there were dozens more in the vault, possibly hundreds. Her hands, resting on the counter, trembled slightly. She forced them to be still. "If I wanted to sell," she said carefully, "how would that work?" Mr. Morse explained the process. For a collection of this nature, he would conduct a full appraisal, providing a detailed inventory and estimated values. If Sarah chose to sell through his firm, he would purchase outright at 90% of appraised value, a standard dealer margin. Alternatively, he could place pieces on consignment, selling them to collectors over time and taking a smaller commission but potentially realizing higher prices. "How many coins are we discussing?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. This was the moment where she could retreat, claim it was just these 3, or she could commit to the path that would change everything. "More than 3, she said finally. "Possibly 100, possibly more. And there's currency as well. Old bills, bonds. I haven't cataloged everything yet." Mr. Morse's expression did not change dramatically, but Sarah saw the slight widening of his eyes, the minute adjustment of posture that indicated he understood the scale of what she was describing. "That would be a significant estate collection," he said. "I would need to see everything to provide accurate valuations, of course. But based on what you show me today, we could be discussing substantial value." "How substantial?" Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "That depends on many factors, exact denominations, conditions, rarity. But if the quality is consistent with these samples, and if the quantity is as you suggest." He paused, choosing words carefully. "We could be discussing a mid-6-figure sum, possibly more." The number sat between them, enormous and undeniable. Sarah nodded slowly, trying to appear less shocked than she was. "I'd like to think about next steps," she said. "Can I contact you once I've done a full inventory?" "Of course." Mr. Morse provided her with a business card and a brief guide to cataloging coins and currency. "Take your time. These pieces have waited decades. A few more weeks won't diminish their value." Sarah thanked him and left. The 3 coins returned to her envelope. Outside, the street seemed impossibly bright, impossibly normal. People passed by, carrying coffee, walking dogs, living lives that did not include the knowledge she now carried. She had just confirmed what she had suspected, but not quite believed. The vault contained enough wealth to transform her life completely. She returned to her car and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. The implications were still unfolding in her mind. 6 figures, possibly more. That was not pay off the debt money. That was start over money. That was build something new money. That was Maya's entire future money. But claiming it would require navigating systems Sarah barely understood. Taxes, inheritance laws, reporting requirements. She needed help, professional help, from people who would ask fewer questions than she could comfortably answer. She needed to move carefully, protecting not just the money but the process of claiming it. The drive back to Meridian Falls happened almost on autopilot. She needed to see the mansion again, to confirm that the vault was still there, that she had not imagined it. When she arrived, the structure looked exactly as it always had, collapsing, worthless, condemned. But now Sarah saw it differently. It was no longer a liability. It was a guardian, protecting something valuable beneath layers of decay that discouraged anyone from looking too closely. She descended into the basement again, moved through the tunnel, and stood in the vault room. The boxes remained undisturbed, stacked with patient precision. She allowed herself a moment of pure feeling, without the filter of planning or caution. This was hers. This impossible, improbable fortune was hers. She had inherited it through accident and genealogical chance, had claimed it when everyone told her to walk away, had discovered it through simple persistence when any rational person would have given up. The Blackwoods had built their mansion to last, had created beauty that would endure. And beneath that beauty, they had hidden security, wealth preserved against uncertainty. That security had outlasted the beauty. The house above had fallen, but the foundation below remained. And now, a century later, their careful planning would save someone they never knew, would give a struggling mother and her daughter the kind of life Margaret Blackwood had once anxiously hoped to build. Sarah closed the vault door behind her and returned to the surface. She had work to do. Documentation to complete, professionals to consult, time to buy from a county that wanted the problem resolved. But for the first time since receiving that initial letter, she felt something other than trapped. She felt the stirring of what might, with great care and no small amount of luck, become hope. The process of extraction took longer than Sarah had anticipated, not because of physical difficulty, but because of the care required at every step. She could not simply load boxes into her car and drive away. Each movement needed to be documented, each coin cataloged, each decision made with an awareness that mistakes now could cost her everything she had discovered. She returned to Meridian Falls the following weekend, this time with equipment purchased carefully over the preceding days. Heavy-duty plastic storage containers with airtight seals, foam padding, a portable scale, latex gloves to prevent oil from her hands damaging the coins, a better camera for detailed photography. The purchases had consumed nearly $200, money she could barely afford, but she understood that protecting the collection's value required investment. In the vault room, she worked systematically. Each box was opened, its contents photographed as a group, then individually. Each coin was weighed, measured, and logged in the notebook with clinical precision. Date, denomination, condition notes. The paper currency received similar treatment. She noted serial numbers, signatures, dates of issue. The bonds were more challenging. Their terms and conditions were printed in dense legal language that required research to understand. She photographed every page, every clause, trusting that experts would later determine their value. The work was tedious and physically uncomfortable. The basement was damp and cold, requiring her to take frequent breaks to warm her hands and restore feeling to her fingers. The tunnel was narrow enough that moving the filled storage containers required awkward maneuvering. By the time she had transferred half the vault's contents to her car, hidden beneath blankets in the trunk and back seat, darkness had fallen outside. She made 3 trips in total, spread across 2 weeks. Each time, she drove home with a fortune in precious metals concealed in ordinary plastic bins, feeling the surreal weight of what she carried. If she were stopped by police for any reason, if an accident occurred, if someone suspected what her unremarkable vehicle contained, the complications would be insurmountable. But she drove carefully, obeying every traffic law with paranoid precision, and arrived home each time without incident. The storage was its own challenge. Her studio apartment offered no safe place to keep such valuable items. She could not rent a safety deposit box large enough, and attempting to do so would raise questions she could not answer. Eventually, she settled on a solution that felt absurd but was pragmatic. She kept the containers in her closet, hidden beneath clothes and behind boxes of Maya's old toys. It was not secure in any meaningful sense, but the apartment building was unremarkable enough that no one would think to look there. Sometimes the best hiding place was the most obvious one. With the vault emptied and its contents secured, Sarah turned her attention to the next phase: authentication and sale. She contacted Richard Morse again, this time requesting a private appointment at his office rather than the retail shop. She explained that she had completed her inventory and was ready for a full appraisal. His response was prompt and professional. They scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday, an appointment that would require Sarah to take another personal day from work. She arrived at his office 30 minutes early, parking in a nearby garage and walking the last 3 blocks with 2 containers that represented only a portion of the collection, but enough to establish its scope. The office was in an older building, its interior maintained but showing the patina of decades. Mr. Morse met her himself, ushering her into a private room where a large table had been cleared for examination. Over the next 2 hours, he worked through the containers methodically. He said little as he examined each coin, occasionally making notes or taking photographs for his records. When he finished with the first container, he looked up at Sarah with an expression that was carefully neutral but could not entirely conceal his professional excitement. "This is an extraordinary collection," he said, "not just in quantity, but in quality. Many of these coins are in remarkably good condition given their age. Whoever stored them understood proper preservation techniques." "The family that owned them," Sarah said. "They were wealthy. Careful." Mr. Morse nodded. "That's evident. I'm seeing coins here that don't often come to market. Several are quite rare. The paper currency is equally impressive. Some of these denominations are highly sought after by collectors." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You mentioned there was more than what you've brought today." "About twice this amount," Sarah said. She had decided to reveal the full scope gradually, gauging his response before committing completely. "I see." Mr. Morse set down the coin he had been examining. "Miss Chun, I want to be direct with you. A collection of this size and value is beyond the scope of what most individual dealers can handle as a simple cash purchase. We're discussing a sum that would be, conservatively, in the seven-figure range. Sarah felt her breath catch. 7 figures. She had hoped for 6, had allowed herself to imagine high 6 figures in optimistic moments. 7 was beyond what she had permitted herself to believe possible. However, Mr. Morse continued, there are established procedures for collections like this. If you're willing to work through the proper channels, appraisal, authentication through recognized grading services, placement with appropriate buyers, the value can be fully realized. I can facilitate that process, but it will take time. Several months, possibly longer. How long? Sarah needed specifics. The county's deadline loomed, and while she had managed to secure a 60-day extension through careful correspondence, that extension would eventually expire. 3 to 6 months for a complete liquidation, Mr. Morse said. We could structure it more quickly if you're willing to accept slightly lower prices. Or we could arrange an advance against the authenticated value, which would allow you access to funds while the sales process continues. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing this information. Months of waiting. Months during which the county might escalate its demands, during which something could go wrong, during which her carefully maintained secret could unravel. And yet, the alternative, rushing the sale to unscrupulous buyers who would exploit her ignorance, was worse. What would an advance look like, she asked. Mr. Morse consulted his notes. Based on what I've examined today, and assuming the remainder of the collection is consistent in quality, I would be comfortable offering an immediate advance of $200,000. That would be secured against the final sale proceeds, with the balance paid as items sell. My firm's commission would be 15% of the gross sales amount. $200,000. Immediate. Sarah's mind raced through calculations. That was enough to pay the county fines. Enough to pay off her debts entirely. Enough to move, to establish stability, to stop the constant triage that defined her life. And it was only a fraction of what the collection would ultimately bring. I need to think about this, she said. And I should probably consult a lawyer. You absolutely should, Mr. Morse agreed. In fact, I recommend it strongly. A collection of this value deserves proper legal counsel. You'll want guidance on tax implications, estate documentation, transfer procedures. I could provide referrals if you'd like. Sarah accepted the referrals, thanked Mr. Morse for his time, and left with the containers still in her possession. She had not yet committed to selling through his firm, but his professionalism and transparency had impressed her. This was not someone trying to cheat her. This was someone who understood that his reputation depended on fair dealing, especially with clients who came to him with minimal knowledge and maximal vulnerability. The lawyer Mr. Morse recommended was a woman named Patricia Landry, whose practice specialized in estate law and high-value asset transfers. Her initial consultation fee was $300, money Sarah barely had, but understood was necessary. They met in Ms. Landry's office, a space that managed to feel both professional and approachable, and Sarah explained the situation as honestly as she could. She had inherited a condemned property. While exploring it, she had discovered a hidden vault containing coins, currency, and bonds. She had begun the authentication process. She needed guidance on how to proceed legally, how to report the income, how to protect herself from claims that she had acquired the assets improperly. Ms. Landry listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. When Sarah finished, the lawyer sat back and regarded her client with an expression that was impossible to read. First, Ms. Landry said, I want to confirm that you inherited this property legally. You have a deed properly filed? Yes. Sarah had brought the deed with her, along with the letter from the law firm that had managed the estate transfer. Ms. Landry examined the documents, nodding slowly. Good. That establishes clear ownership. The property is yours, which means anything contained within it is also yours. There's no legal ambiguity there. What about taxes? Sarah asked. If I sell the collection, what do I owe? That depends on several factors, Ms. Landry explained. Inheritance itself is generally not taxable at the federal level, though some states have inheritance taxes. However, when you sell inherited assets, any appreciation in value between inheritance and sale is subject to capital gains tax. Given that these assets were hidden and undocumented, establishing their value at the time of inheritance will be challenging but important. She explained the strategy. They would need to have the collection appraised as of the date Sarah received the deed, retroactive appraisal based on market conditions at that time. Then, when items sold, the capital gains would be calculated as the difference between that baseline value and the sale price. Given the age of the collection and the fact that precious metals prices fluctuated, the gains might be substantial, but they would be taxed at the long-term capital gains rate, which was more favorable than ordinary income rates. You'll need to report this properly, Ms. Landry emphasized. The IRS takes a dim view of sudden, unexplained wealth. But if you document everything, maintain clear records, and report accurately, there's nothing illegal about what you're doing. You found something on property you legally own. You're selling it through legitimate channels. You're paying the appropriate taxes. This is completely above board. Sarah felt the tension she had not fully acknowledged begin to loosen. She had been half expecting to be told that her discovery was somehow tainted, that claiming it would be impossible without lengthy legal battles. Instead, Ms. Landry was telling her that the path forward, while complex, was straightforward. They discussed timing and strategy. Ms. Landry recommended accepting the advance from Mr. Morse's firm, using those funds to address the most pressing obligations while the full authentication process continued. She would draft a contract between Sarah and the dealership, ensuring that terms were clear and protections were in place. She would also help Sarah establish proper financial accounts for managing the incoming funds, separate from her regular checking, structured to facilitate clear tracking for tax purposes. One more thing, Ms. Landry said as their meeting concluded. You're going to experience significant life changes very quickly. Wealth changes relationships, even when people don't know you have it. Be careful who you trust. Be thoughtful about what you reveal and when. And consider working with a financial advisor who specializes in windfall management. Many people who come into sudden wealth mismanage it quickly. You've been careful so far. Stay careful. The advice settled into Sarah's mind alongside everything else she was trying to process. She thanked Ms. Landry, paid the consultation fee, and left with a list of next steps that felt both overwhelming and achievable. Document everything. Finalize the agreement with the coin dealer. Set up proper accounts. File the necessary tax forms when the time came. Simple in concept, demanding in execution. Over the next month, Sarah moved through these steps with the same methodical attention she had applied to cataloging the vault. She signed the contract with Richard Morse's firm, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote her name on documents that would transfer millions of dollars worth of assets over the coming months. She received the advance, $200,000 deposited into a new account Ms. Landry had helped her establish, and stared at the balance on her phone screen for a full minute, unable to quite believe the numbers were real. With that money, she paid the county fines immediately, adding a letter explaining that she was in the process of arranging proper demolition and requesting patience as she coordinated with contractors. The fines cleared, the immediate legal threat vanished. For the first time in months, she was not waiting for another notice demanding payment she could not provide. She paid off her medical debts next. All of them. The collections agencies, the hospital billing departments, the credit card balances that had accumulated from covering co-pays and medications. She made the payments online, watching each balance drop to zero with a feeling that was less relief than vindication. These debts had haunted her for years, had limited her options, had made her feel perpetually behind. Now they were simply gone, erased as easily as digital entries were deleted. What remained after those payments was still more money than Sarah had ever possessed at once. She did not touch it immediately. She let it sit in the account, earning minimal interest while she considered how to use it wisely. Ms. Landry had warned against sudden, visible changes. Buying a house outright would raise questions. New cars, expensive possessions, any dramatic shift in lifestyle would invite scrutiny from people who knew she worked at a call center. but there were changes she could make that would remain below the threshold of notice. She gave notice at her apartment, citing a desire to move closer to Maya's school. She found a rental house on the other side of the city, 2 bedrooms, a yard, in a neighborhood that was safe but not ostentatious. The rent was higher than her current apartment, but still within what someone with her apparent income might reasonably afford. She signed a lease and felt something fundamental shift. Maya would have her own room. They would have space to live, not merely survive. The transformation was not instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, deliberately, with Sarah maintaining the same job, the same routine, while privately dismantling the architecture of scarcity that had defined their lives. She opened a savings account for Maya's education, funding it with an amount that would grow substantially over time, but did not require explanation now. She scheduled a dental appointment for herself, addressing problems she had ignored for years because the cost seemed insurmountable. She bought groceries without calculating every item, choosing food based on nutrition and preference rather than price alone. Maya noticed the changes, of course, but Sarah framed them carefully. She explained that she had received money from the estate, enough to improve their situation modestly. She did not mention the full scope of the discovery. Maya was 6. She could not be expected to keep secrets that adults would press her to reveal. Instead, Sarah allowed her daughter to experience the improvements as simple good fortune, a break in the pattern of struggle that had been their norm. The move itself happened on a Saturday in late spring. Sarah had arranged for a modest moving truck, though they had little to move beyond clothes, Maya's toys, and the few pieces of furniture that belonged to them rather than the apartment. As they loaded boxes, Diane arrived to help, her expression shifting between happiness for Sarah and barely concealed confusion about how her friend had managed this apparent leap in circumstances. "I didn't know the estate had money," Diane said, carrying a box-marked kitchen to the truck. "It didn't," Sarah said, which was true enough. "The property had value I didn't realize. I sold some architectural elements. Got lucky with the timing." Diane accepted this explanation, or at least pretended to. Sarah could see the questions forming behind her friend's eyes, but Diane was kind enough not to press. Instead, she helped load the truck and made supportive comments about the new house being perfect for them. When they finished, Sarah hugged her and felt the weight of deception press briefly against her chest. Diane had been there during the worst times, had watched Maya when Sarah worked extra shifts, had never asked for anything in return. She deserved honesty. But honesty about the vault would invite exactly the kind of attention Ms. Landry had warned against. The new house was modest by most standards, built in the 1970s, slightly dated in its finishes, but clean and structurally sound. It had a living room that could fit actual furniture, a kitchen with full appliances, and a small backyard where grass grew in uneven patches. To Maya, it might as well have been a mansion. She ran through the rooms, exclaiming over each new discovery. Her own room, a bathtub, a window that looked out onto trees rather than the neighboring building's brick wall. That night, after they had unpacked enough to make the space functional, Sarah sat on the edge of Maya's new bed and watched her daughter arrange stuffed animals on shelves that had been built into the wall. The girl worked with focused concentration, placing each toy deliberately, creating an order that satisfied some internal logic. "Do you like it here?" Sarah asked, though the answer was obvious. "I love it," Maya said without looking up. "It feels like the house I drew." Sarah remembered the drawing, the one that still sat in a folder with other documents Sarah was saving. "Our house," Maya had written, and now, improbably, impossibly, it was true. They had a house. Not owned yet, but that would come. When the full proceeds from the collection sale were realized, when Sarah had navigated the tax implications and structured her finances properly, she would buy something permanent. But even this rental, temporary as it was, represented a transformation that had seemed unreachable just months earlier. The vindication came gradually rather than dramatically. There was no single moment when those who had doubted her were confronted with proof of their error. Instead, awareness spread through small encounters and quiet observations. Diane was the first to piece together that something significant had shifted. She noticed that Sarah had stopped taking extra shifts. She observed that Sarah's car, while still old, had been repaired. The check engine light no longer glowed. The strange noise from the transmission had been addressed. When they met for coffee one Saturday, Diane finally asked directly, "What really happened with that property?" Sarah had prepared for this question, had rehearsed an answer that was truthful in its outline, if not its details. "I found some valuable items in the house. Architectural salvage, antiques, old coins. More than I expected. Enough to clear my debts and improve our situation." "How much more?" "Enough to stop worrying about next month," Sarah said carefully. "Not life-changing wealth, but significant." Diane studied her friend's face, searching for the fuller truth Sarah was not offering. Finally, she nodded. "I'm glad. I worried about you. I worried you'd made a mistake with that property." "Everyone did," Sarah said. "I worried too. But it worked out. It worked out." The conversation moved on, but Sarah knew Diane would continue to wonder. The gap between stop worrying money and the actual scale of the discovery was vast, and Diane was perceptive enough to sense that Sarah had not revealed everything. But she was also loyal enough not to press, choosing to accept the partial truth and be happy for her friend's good fortune. Sarah's sister Lisa called a few weeks later, having heard through some family network that Sarah had moved. The conversation began with casual questions. Where was the new place? Was it nice? How was Maya adjusting? Before Lisa's tone shifted to something more pointed. "Mom's old friend Carol said she saw you a lawyer's office downtown. The kind of office that handles estate law." Sarah felt a flash of irritation. Even now, even with distance and different lives, the family grapevine functioned with unsettling efficiency. "I needed legal advice about the property I inherited," she said. "It's complicated. Complicated good or complicated bad?" "Complicated resolved," Sarah said, letting a note of finality enter her voice. "The property situation is handled. We're fine. Better than fine." Lisa was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone had softened. "I'm sorry I told you to walk away from it. I thought I was being practical." "You were being practical," Sarah said. "It was risky. It could have gone badly. I just got lucky." "Lucky," Lisa repeated, and Sarah could hear the doubt beneath the word. But Lisa, like Diane, chose not to excavate further. "Well, I'm glad it worked out. You deserve some luck." The conversation ended with promises to visit, though both sisters knew those visits would remain infrequent. Their lives had diverged too much for easy connection. But the acknowledgement mattered. Lisa had doubted, had offered advice rooted in that doubt, and now had to recognize that Sarah's improbable choice had yielded results Lisa's safer path never could have produced. The most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. 3 months after accepting the advance, Sarah received a call from the county office that had sent the original violation notices. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Janet Reeves, a supervisor in the code enforcement department. Her tone was professional, but carried an undertone of confusion. "Ms. Chun, I'm calling about the property at 47 Blackwood Lane. Our records show the fines were paid several months ago, and we received correspondence indicating you were arranging demolition." "That's correct," Sarah said carefully, uncertain where this was leading. "We've had an inquiry," Ms. Reeves continued. "A historical preservation group learned about the property and wanted to know its status. Apparently, the Blackwood Mansion is considered historically significant in the region. There's interest in potentially salvaging elements of the structure before any demolition proceeds." Sarah felt a smile form despite herself. The mansion, which the county had been so eager to see removed, was now being reconsidered as something worth preserving. The irony was perfect. "I'm open to working with preservation groups," she said. "In fact, I've been reconsidering the demolition timeline. The structure is unsafe, but I'd like to explore whether partial preservation is possible." "That would be..." Ms. Reeves paused, apparently consulting notes. "That would be appreciated. I'll forward your contact information to the preservation group. They may reach out to discuss options." After the call ended, Sarah sat with her phone in hand, savoring the moment. The county that had threatened her with foreclosure was now calling to facilitate preservation. The property everyone had told her to abandon was being recognized as valuable beyond its monetary worth. She had been right to keep it, not because she had anticipated the vault. That had been pure chance, but because she had refused to accept others' certainty that it was worthless. The preservation group did contact her, a nonprofit organization dedicated to maintaining historical structures in the region. Their representative, a woman named Dr. Ellen Voss, explained that the Blackwood Mansion was one of the last examples of a particular architectural style in the county. While full restoration was impractical given the extent of damage, elements could be documented, salvaged, and preserved in archives or relocated to other projects. Would you be willing to allow access for documentation and selective salvage? Dr. Voss asked during their phone conversation. We could coordinate with your timeline and ensure it doesn't interfere with your ultimate plans for the property. I'd welcome that, Sarah said. And she meant it. The mansion had given her everything. Allowing it to contribute one final time to the historical record felt appropriate. I'd also like to donate the property deed to your organization once the salvage is complete. Let the land return to the county or be used for something that benefits the community. Dr. Voss was momentarily silent, apparently surprised by the offer. That's extraordinarily generous, Ms. Chen. Are you certain? I'm certain. Sarah had already discussed this with Ms. Landry, who had confirmed it was legally straightforward and would provide a tax benefit. But the decision was not about taxes. It was about closure. The mansion had served its purpose in her life. What remained was ruins and land she did not need. Better to let it go properly than to hold onto it out of possessiveness. The work of the preservation group unfolded over several weeks. They documented the structure extensively, photographing every intact detail, creating architectural drawings that captured what had been before collapse. They salvaged the mantel from the parlor, the built-in shelving from the library, dozens of small elements that would be cataloged and stored. Sarah did not attend these sessions. She had taken what she needed from the mansion. What remained was for others to claim. By summer's end, the final authentication of the collection was complete. Richard Morse's firm had successfully placed the majority of high-value items with collectors and institutions. The paper currency had sold to a dealer who specialized in obsolete bills. The bonds, after extensive research, had been determined to retain partial value. Not their face amounts, but enough to add another substantial sum to the total. When the final accounting was complete, Sarah sat with Ms. Landry reviewing the numbers. The collection had realized $2 million in gross sales. After the dealer's commission, authentication costs, and legal fees, Sarah's net proceeds were just over $900,000. From that, she owed capital gains taxes that would reduce the total by approximately $200,000. What remained, after every deduction and obligation, was $700,000. Sarah looked at the number in the final accounting document and felt not elation, but a profound, settling calm. $700,000. It was less than the initial, most optimistic estimates, but it was also more money than she had ever imagined possessing. Managed properly, invested wisely, it would provide security for decades. Maya's education was secured. Their housing was secured. The margin for error that had been absent from Sarah's entire adult life was now present, substantial, protective. What will you do now? Ms. Landry asked, closing the folder that contained their final business together. I don't know, Sarah admitted. Keep working for a while. I don't want sudden changes that attract attention. But eventually, maybe go back to school. I always wanted to finish my degree. You should, Ms. Landry said. You've demonstrated remarkable persistence and judgment throughout this process. Those qualities should be directed towards something you care about. Sarah thanked her and left the office, stepping out into late summer sunshine that seemed brighter than usual. She walked several blocks before reaching her car, using the time to let the finality of the moment settle in. The collection was sold. The taxes were arranged. The property was being donated. The chapter that had begun with an absurd letter offering a condemned mansion for $1 was closing. That evening, she sat with Maya in their small backyard, watching her daughter play with a neighbor child who had become a friend. The two girls ran in circles, laughing with the unself-conscious joy of children who did not yet understand how complicated life would become. Sarah thought about Margaret Blackwood's letter, the one she had found in the metal box. Margaret had worried about overextending, about whether the mansion was too grand. She had not lived long enough to see it collapse, but her careful husband had preserved something that outlasted the grandeur. Sarah understood now what the Blackwoods had created, perhaps without fully intending it. They had built beauty that was temporary and security that endured. The mansion had fallen, but the foundation had held. And that foundation, hidden and forgotten, had waited through decades until someone desperate enough to claim a worthless property had been patient enough to discover what lay beneath. The money would change many things, but it would not change the core truth that had brought Sarah here. She had refused to accept others' definitions of what was possible. She had claimed something everyone dismissed. She had worked methodically when urgency pressed her to rush. She had kept secrets when revelation would have brought disaster. These qualities, stubbornness, patience, discretion, had served her better than any amount of initial wealth could have. As autumn approached, Sarah made one final trip to Meridian Falls. The preservation group had completed their work, and the structure was being prepared for controlled demolition. She wanted to see it one last time before it disappeared entirely. When she arrived, the mansion looked even more diminished than before. The salvage work had removed elements that had held it together, and the remaining structure sagged with visible exhaustion. She did not enter. She simply stood in the overgrown yard and allowed herself a moment of gratitude. This building, this impossible inheritance, had saved her, not because it was valuable in the way people usually measured value, but because it had protected something valuable long enough for the right person to find it. She thought about all the people who might have inherited it before her, all the genealogical accidents that had to align for it to reach someone desperate enough to accept it. "Thank you," she said quietly to the structure, feeling foolish but meaning it completely. As she drove away, she did not look back. The mansion would fall soon, would be reduced to rubble and hauled away. The land would return to its natural state or be developed into something new. The Blackwood name would fade further into historical obscurity, remembered only in the archives of preservation societies and the private knowledge of one single mother who had been saved by their careful planning a century after they died. Sarah returned to her life, to work, to Maya, to the ordinary routines that had been transformed by extraordinary circumstance. She told no one the full story. When people asked about her improved circumstances, she offered the partial truth about architectural salvage and estate items. Most accepted this explanation. Those who suspected more chose not to press. The truth was hers to keep or reveal, and she chose to keep it, understanding that some fortunes were best protected by silence. At night, sometimes she would take out the brass doorknob she had found on her first visit to the mansion. She kept it on her dresser, a small artifact that connected her to the Blackwoods and to the moment when her life had changed. She would hold it, feeling its weight, remembering the collapsed entrance hall where she had found it half buried in plaster dust. That doorknob had once been attached to a door that led somewhere. Now it led nowhere, but it remained beautiful, carefully crafted, a testament to the idea that even utilitarian objects deserved attention. Maya asked about it once. "What's that from?" "From the house I inherited," Sarah said. "The one that was falling down." "Can I hold it?" Sarah handed it to her daughter, watching as Maya turned it in the light, examining its details. "It's pretty," Maya said, "even though it's old." "Especially because it's old," Sarah corrected gently. "Someone made this by hand a long time ago. They wanted it to be beautiful, even though it was just a doorknob. They cared about the details." Maya nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting the weight her mother placed on the object. She handed it back and returned to her homework. Sarah set the doorknob back on the dresser and thought about inheritance. Not just money and property, but values. The Blackwoods had valued quality, permanence, careful preservation. They had hidden their wealth not out of paranoia, but out of prudence, understanding that security required preparation for uncertainties they could not predict. Sarah had inherited their preparation. Now she would create her own. The money would be invested wisely, not spent recklessly. Maya would grow up understanding that security was precious and should not be taken for granted. She would learn to value quality over quantity, patience over immediate gratification, discretion over display. These were lessons Sarah had learned through necessity. Now, she could teach them from a position of stability rather than desperation. Years later, when Maya was older, Sarah would tell her the full story. She would explain about the vault, about the coins and currency, about the fortune hidden beneath a collapsing mansion. She would explain why she had kept it secret, why discretion had mattered, why some truths needed to be protected until the time was right to reveal them. And Maya would understand, or begin to understand, that their life had been shaped by a combination of desperation, persistence, and the kind of luck that only comes to those willing to claim what others dismiss as worthless. But that conversation was years away. For now, Sarah lived in the present, in the house with 2 bedrooms and a yard, working a job that no longer felt like a trap because she knew she could leave it when she chose. She lived with the knowledge that she had done something remarkable, something that would never be recognized publicly, but that she would carry privately as proof that she had been right to refuse other certainty. The condemned mansion that everyone told her to abandon had contained the solution to every problem that defined her life. And she had found it because she had been willing to look where others would not, to claim what others feared, to persist when every reasonable voice counseled retreat. That persistence, that refusal to accept prescribed limits, was the real inheritance. The money would help, would provide security and opportunities. But the knowledge that she had earned it through her own choices, her own work, her own stubborn determination to see possibility in ruins, that was what she would carry forward, what she would pass to her daughter, what would define their lives more than any amount of currency ever could. The mansion had fallen. The fortune had been claimed. And Sarah Chen, who had spent years measuring her life in small survivals and careful compromises, could finally imagine a future that extended beyond the next crisis, the next bill, the next threat of collapse. She had inherited ruins. She had found foundation. And from that foundation, she would build something that would last. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.